I never believed in the supernatural. Not really. I was the kind of person who explained away every strange noise, every unexplained coincidence, every gut feeling that screamed danger. Fear, I used to tell myself, was just my brain's primitive way of protecting me from things I didn't want to face. Logic was my armor. Reason was my shield. But that was before I met Dante Ashmore. Before him, my life was predictable in the most comfortable way possible. I worked as a graphic designer from my apartment, ordered the same coffee every morning, ran the same route through the park 3 times a week. My world was small, controlled, safe. I liked it that way. After my last relationship ended badly, my ex, Marcus, had a way of making me feel like I was never quite enough. I'd built walls around myself, thick ones, the kind that kept everyone at a careful distance. I told myself I was healing, that I was learning to be alone without being lonely. But the truth, I was hiding from connection, from vulnerability, from the possibility of being hurt again. Everything changed on October 13th. It was a Thursday, I remember, because Thursday was the day the building's maintenance crew was supposed to fix the flickering lights in the hallway. They never showed up. Instead, around 8:30 in the evening, the entire condominium went dark. Not just my apartment, the whole building. The kind of darkness that makes you realize how much you rely on electricity, how exposed you become when modern conveniences disappear. I was in my living room, laptop open, working on a project that was due the next morning when everything just stopped. The hum of the refrigerator died. The glow from my screen vanished. Even the ambient noise from the street seemed to get swallowed by the sudden void. I sat there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust, my heart doing that annoying thing where it speeds up for no rational reason. My phone was in the bedroom, of course, because I'd left it charging, so I stood up, hands out in front of me like a child playing blind man's bluff, and started to navigate toward the hallway. That's when I heard the knock, not on my door, exactly. It was more like someone tapping on the door frame from the outside hallway. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, the kind that sound like they're asking permission rather than demanding attention. My first instinct was to ignore it. Whoever it was could come back when the lights were on. But then I heard a voice, low and smooth, calling through the wood. He told me not to be afraid, that he lived down the hall and wanted to check if I was all right. He said his name was Dante, and that he had a flashlight if I needed one. Something about his voice made me pause. It wasn't just polite, it was careful, measured, as if he was choosing every word with surgical precision. But there was also something underneath it, something that felt oddly familiar even though I'd never heard it before. I made my way to the door, keeping the chain lock on, and opened it just enough to see out. The hallway was pitch black, but I could make out his silhouette, backlit by what must have been his phone's flashlight. Tall, lean, with shoulders that suggested someone who knew how to carry himself. He angled the light away from my eyes, which I appreciated, and told me that the power company estimated it would take at least another hour to restore electricity. He asked if I was comfortable waiting alone in the dark, or if I wanted company. The question should have felt invasive. A strange man, in a blackout, asking to keep me company. But the way he said it, like he was offering help to someone lost, not like he had ulterior motives, it disarmed me completely. I told him I was fine, but thanked him for checking. He didn't push. He simply said that if I changed my mind, his apartment was 7B, just 3 doors down. Then he mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had candles and a battery-powered radio if I needed either. Before I could respond, the lights flickered back on. 1 second, we were standing in complete darkness, and the next, the harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway were buzzing back to life. I blinked against the sudden brightness, and when my eyes adjusted, I got my first real look at Dante Ashmore. He was beautiful, not in the conventional way, not like the men in cologne advertisements or romantic comedies. His beauty was the kind that made you uncomfortable, the kind that felt too perfect, too deliberate, like an artist had spent years sculpting every angle of his face. His skin was pale, not sickly, but the kind of pale that made you think of marble statues or winter mornings. His hair was dark, almost black, and fell just above his collar in a way that looked effortlessly styled, but it was his eyes that caught me. They were an unusual shade of gray, the color of storm clouds, and when they met mine, I felt something shift in my chest, a recognition I couldn't name. He smiled, and I realized I'd been staring. He made some joke about the lights having impeccable timing, and I laughed, more to break the tension than because it was funny. He asked if I was sure I was okay, and I told him yes, definitely, and thanked him again for checking on me. As he turned to walk back to his apartment, he mentioned that he'd just moved in a few weeks ago, that he was still getting used to the building. He said it would be nice to have a friendly face around. I watched him disappear down the hallway, and when I closed my door, I found myself leaning against it, heart racing in a way that had nothing to do with the blackout. That should have been the end of it. A neighborly encounter, nothing more. But it wasn't. Because 2 days later, I saw him again. I was coming back from the grocery store, arms full of bags, struggling to find my keys at the bottom of my purse, when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned, expecting to see one of the elderly residents who were always puttering around the hallways, but instead, it was Dante. He appeared so suddenly that I actually startled, nearly dropping my bags. He apologized for sneaking up on me, said he'd just been heading out for a walk and saw me struggling. Before I could protest, he'd taken 3 of my bags and was asking which apartment was mine. As we walked to my door, he made easy conversation. He asked what I did for work, how long I'd lived in the building, if I liked the neighborhood. His questions felt genuine, not like small talk for the sake of filling silence, but like he actually wanted to know the answers. When I mentioned that I was a graphic designer, he told me that he'd always admired people who could create something out of nothing, that there was a kind of magic in taking a blank canvas and making it mean something. The way he said magic made my skin prickle. When we reached my apartment, he set the bags down carefully by the door and stepped back, maintaining a respectful distance. I thanked him, told him he didn't have to help, but that I appreciated it. He said it was his pleasure, and then he did something that stuck with me. He looked at my doorway, really looked at it, like he was studying it, and then his eyes met mine with an intensity that made my breath catch. He told me I should always keep my door locked, even during the day, that this building might seem safe, but appearances could be deceiving. I asked him if something had happened, if I should be worried, but he just shook his head and told me he was probably being paranoid, that he'd lived in rougher neighborhoods before and old habits died hard. But the way he said it, the slight tension in his jaw, the way his hands flexed at his sides, it didn't feel like paranoia. It felt like a warning. After that, I started seeing him more frequently. Not in a creepy, stalkerish way. At least, that's what I told myself at the time. He just seemed to have an uncanny ability to be in the right place at the right moment. When I was leaving for my morning run, he'd be in the lobby, offering a friendly wave. When I came home late from visiting a friend, he'd be taking out his trash, asking if I'd had a good evening. When my internet went out and I was on the phone with customer service, ready to throw my router out the window, he knocked on my door and offered to take a look at it. He fixed it in 15 minutes. Every interaction was pleasant, courteous, helpful. He never overstayed his welcome, never asked invasive questions, never made me feel uncomfortable. If anything, he was the perfect neighbor, the kind of person who restores your faith in humanity. But there was always something underneath it, something I couldn't quite name. It was in the way he moved, too fluid, too graceful, like he'd rehearsed every gesture. It was in the way he spoke, like he was translating his thoughts from another language before letting them out. And it was in the way he looked at me, like he knew something about me that I didn't know about myself. After about 3 weeks of these casual encounters, he asked me out for coffee. We were in the elevator together, heading down to the lobby, and he mentioned this cafe he'd discovered a few blocks away. He said their espresso was the best he'd had in the city, and that he thought I might appreciate it, given how much coffee I seemed to drink. He'd noticed the cups I carried back from the shop on the corner. I agreed before I could overthink it. That first coffee date turned into dinner the following week. Dinner turned into a walk through the park. The walk turned into a late-night conversation on a bench by the pond, where we talked about everything and nothing until the city lights reflected on the water like fallen stars. Dante was easy to be with. He listened more than he talked. But when he did speak, his words felt carefully chosen, meaningful. He asked about my childhood, my dreams, my fears. He wanted to know what made me laugh, what kept me up at night, what I saw when I closed my eyes and imagined my future. I found myself telling him things I hadn't told anyone, about my parents' messy divorce when I was 12, about how I'd learned to make myself small, invisible, so I wouldn't become collateral damage in their war, about Marcus, and how he'd chipped away at my confidence so slowly that I hadn't noticed until I was hollow, about how I was trying to rebuild myself, but sometimes I wasn't sure there was anything solid to rebuild from. He listened to all of it without judgment, without trying to fix me or offer platitudes. When I finished, he simply reached across the table and placed his hand over mine. His skin was cold, not unpleasantly so, just noticeably cool, and he told me that I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. That survival wasn't about emerging unscathed. It was about carrying your scars and still choosing to live. In that moment, I felt seen in a way I hadn't in years. But he never reciprocated. Whenever I asked about his life, his past, his family, he'd deflect with practiced ease. He told me that his childhood wasn't particularly interesting, that he'd moved around a lot, that he preferred to live in the present rather than dwell on yesterday. When I pushed, asking where he'd moved from most recently, he'd give vague answers. The West Coast, a smaller city, nowhere I'd probably heard of. I told myself it didn't matter, that everyone had a right to privacy, to keep certain parts of themselves locked away. God knows I had my own secrets, my own shame I didn't want to share, but it nagged at me. The way he'd listen so intently to my stories but offer nothing in return. The way he'd change the subject whenever the conversation got too close to anything personal about him. The way he seemed to exist only in the present, with no past to anchor him and no future he was willing to discuss. And then there were the stranger things. The things I tried to rationalize away but couldn't quite manage. He only ever wanted to see me at night. When I suggested grabbing lunch, he'd tell me he had work commitments, though I'd never quite figured out what he did for a living. He mentioned something about consulting, freelance work, but it was always vague, always just out of focus. When I proposed a morning coffee before my run, he'd say he wasn't a morning person, that he functioned better after sunset. At first, I found it charming, romantic even. There was something almost cinematic about our nighttime meetings, the way the city transformed after dark, the way the streetlights cast dramatic shadows across his face. But after a few weeks, it started to feel limiting, restrictive, like I was only allowed to know the version of him that existed in darkness. I also noticed that I'd never seen him eat. We'd gone to restaurants at least 5 times, and every time he'd order something, usually just coffee or tea, but he'd never actually consume it. He'd hold the cup, bring it to his lips occasionally, but I never saw him swallow. When I asked about it, he told me he had a sensitive stomach, that he'd eaten earlier, that he preferred to savor drinks rather than food. The excuses were always reasonable, always believable, but they started to pile up. And then there were his eyes. I swear they changed color depending on the lighting. In bright environments, they were that cool gray, like smoke or steel. But in dimmer settings, restaurants lit by candles, the park at twilight, my building's hallway with its perpetually dying bulbs, they looked different, darker, almost black, with just the faintest ring of silver around the pupils. I asked him about it once, tried to make it sound like a compliment, like I was fascinated rather than unnerved. I told him his eyes were striking, that they seemed to shift with his moods. He smiled and told me I was seeing things, that it was just a trick of the light. But the way he said it, with just a hint of tension in his voice, made me wonder if he was reminding himself as much as he was reassuring me. Despite all of this, or maybe because of it, I found myself falling for him. It wasn't the slow, comfortable kind of love I'd imagined after Marcus. It was intense, consuming, the kind of attraction that bypasses your brain and speaks directly to something more primal. When I was with Dante, everything else faded away. My worries, my doubts, my carefully constructed walls, they all crumbled the moment he touched me, and when he touched me, it was electric. His fingertips on my wrist, his hand on the small of my back as we walked, the way he'd brush a strand of hair from my face with such tenderness that I'd forget to breathe. But he never took it further. We'd been seeing each other for almost 2 months, and he'd never even kissed me properly. There were moments, brief, charged moments where I thought he would, where we'd be standing close, his eyes locked on mine, the air between us crackling with tension. But then he'd step back, clearing his throat, making some excuse about it being late or having to be somewhere. It was maddening. I started to wonder if there was something wrong with me, if I was misreading the signals, if maybe he just wanted friendship, and I was projecting my own desires onto him. But then I'd catch the way he looked at me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, like I was something precious and dangerous at the same time, like he wanted to pull me closer and push me away in equal measure. The breaking point came about 10 weeks after we first met. It was late November, and the city had turned cold. Not the gentle, cozy cold of early fall, but the bitter, biting cold that makes you question why humans ever decided to live in places with winter. I'd invited Dante over for dinner at my apartment, the first time I'd explicitly asked him to come inside. Every other time we'd hung out, it had been in public spaces or the building's common areas. He'd walk me to my door, we'd linger in the hallway talking, but he never crossed the threshold. I'd assumed he was being respectful, old-fashioned even, waiting for a clear invitation, so I gave him one. I texted him that I was making pasta, nothing fancy, just something warm to combat the weather, and that I'd love for him to join me. He responded almost immediately, saying he'd be delighted, but when 7 o'clock came and went, he didn't show up. By 7:30, I was checking my phone every few minutes, wondering if I'd somehow missed a message. By 8, the pasta was getting cold, and I was oscillating between worried and annoyed. At 8:15, there was a knock on my door. I opened it to find Dante standing in the hallway, looking off. His skin was even paler than usual, and there was a tightness around his eyes that I'd never seen before. He apologized profusely for being late, told me he'd gotten held up, that he felt terrible for keeping me waiting. I told him it was fine, that I was just glad he was okay, and stepped aside to let him in. He didn't move. He stood there in the hallway, one hand gripping the doorframe, and stared past me into my apartment like it was a chasm he couldn't cross. I asked if something was wrong, if he'd changed his mind about dinner. He shook his head quickly and told me no, that he wanted to come in, that he was just feeling a bit off. He mentioned that he might be coming down with something, that he didn't want to get me sick. I laughed and told him I had a good immune system, that a little cold wasn't going to scare me away. I reached for his hand, intending to gently pull him inside, but the moment my fingers touched his, he jerked back like I'd burned him. The look on his face, it was pure panic, just for a second, just long enough for me to see something wild and desperate in his eyes, and then it was gone, replaced by that careful, controlled expression he always wore. He apologized again, said he was feeling worse than he thought, that maybe it would be better if he went home and rested. He promised we'd reschedule, that he'd make it up to me. And then he turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. I stood there, door still open, watching him disappear around the corner. Something about the way he'd moved, too fast, too fluid, made my stomach turn. I closed the door and leaned against it, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He'd been fine via text, fine when he knocked, but the moment I'd invited him in, it was like an invisible barrier had gone up. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the encounter in my head, looking for clues, for explanations. The more I thought about it, the more I realized how many times this exact scenario had played out, how many excuses he'd made to avoid entering my apartment. He said he had allergies to dust, but my apartment was immaculate. He claimed he had a headache and needed to lie down in his own space, but then why come to my door at all? He mentioned he was claustrophobic and preferred open areas, but he'd been fine in elevators and small cafes. Every reason was different, but the result was always the same. He would not, under any circumstances, step over my threshold. The next morning, I tried to shake off the weirdness. I told myself I was overthinking, that maybe he really had been feeling sick, that I was looking for problems where none existed. But then I ran into Mrs. Castellano. Mrs. Castellano lived on the second floor and had been in the building for over 40 years. She was one of those older women who knew everyone's business, not in a malicious way, but in the way of someone who genuinely cared about her neighbors. She'd always been kind to me, often stopping me in the hallway to ask how I was doing, if I needed anything. That morning, I encountered her in the elevator. We exchanged pleasantries, and then, as the doors were closing, she asked me, in a tone that was trying to sound casual but didn't quite manage it, why I was spending so much time with that pale man who everyone avoids looking in the eyes. Her words hit me like cold water. I asked her what she meant, who she was talking about. She told me she meant Dante, the man from Seven Via, the one I'd been seen with constantly over the past few months. I told her I didn't understand why people would avoid looking at him. She gave me this long, searching look, like she was trying to decide how much to say, and then she leaned in closer. She told me, in a voice barely above a whisper, that she'd seen him before. Not recently, years ago, many years ago. She said he looked exactly the same. Not similar, not like he could be a relative, exactly the same. Down to the clothes he wore, the way he carried himself, the unusual color of his eyes. I laughed it off, told her she must be mistaken, that maybe she was thinking of someone else. People have doppelgangers all the time, but she shook her head firmly. She insisted that she never forgot a face, and that she'd seen him in this very building when she first moved in, back in 1983. 1983, 42 years ago. She told me he'd lived here for a few months, then disappeared without a trace. No forwarding address, no explanation. The landlord at the time had been furious because Dante, or whatever name he'd been using then, had left without breaking his lease properly. The elevator reached her floor, and as she stepped out, she turned back to me and said something I'll never forget. She told me to be careful, that there was something not right about him, that she'd seen the way he looked at me, and it reminded her of the way a collector looks at a rare specimen, with fascination, but not necessarily with kindness. The doors closed before I could respond. I stood there, alone in the elevator, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Part of me wanted to dismiss everything she'd said as the paranoid ramblings of an old woman, but another part, a part I'd been trying to ignore for weeks, recognized the truth in her words. I started paying closer attention after that, watching Dante in ways I hadn't before, looking for inconsistencies, for cracks in the perfect facade he presented. And once I started looking, I couldn't stop seeing them. He never appeared during the day. Not once. I'd tried to surprise him a few times, showing up at his apartment in the late morning or early afternoon, but he never answered. I told myself he must work during those hours, but when I mentioned it, he told me he worked from home, on his own schedule. I never saw him with food. Not just that he didn't eat in front of me. I literally never saw him carrying groceries, never smelled cooking from his apartment, never saw him with so much as a coffee cup that looked used rather than decorative. And then there was the cold. His skin was always cold to the touch. Not cool, like someone who ran cold or had poor circulation. Actually cold, like touching marble on a winter day. I tried to find information about him online. His name, Dante Ashmore, yielded nothing. No social media profiles, no professional listings, no digital footprint whatsoever. In an age where everyone existed online in some capacity, he was a ghost. I told myself there were plenty of people who valued privacy, who stayed off social media, but combined with everything else, it felt significant. The final straw came 3 weeks after my conversation with Mrs. Castellano. It was December 20th, and the building was decorated for the holidays. Someone had strung lights in the hallway, and there was a small Christmas tree in the lobby. The festive atmosphere felt at odds with the growing dread in my stomach. Dante and I were supposed to meet for a walk in the park, but at the last minute, he texted saying something had come up, that he'd come to my place instead. When he arrived at my door, he seemed agitated. Not angry, but restless, like he couldn't quite settle into his own skin. He asked if we could talk, his voice carrying an urgency I'd never heard before. We sat on the floor in my hallway, me with my back against the door, him across from me, leaning against the opposite wall. The overhead light was flickering again, casting strange shadows across his face. He told me he needed to tell me something, but that he didn't know how to say it without me thinking he was insane. He said he'd been trying to find the right words for weeks, that he'd been lying to me, not about how he felt, but about who he was. My throat went dry. Part of me wanted to stop him, to tell him I didn't want to know, that ignorance felt safer. But I forced myself to stay quiet, to let him continue. He explained that he was different from other people, that his life wasn't like mine, that time worked differently for him. He told me he'd been alive far longer than should be possible, that he'd seen centuries pass while he remained unchanged. I asked him what he meant, even though part of me was already assembling the pieces, already seeing the picture they formed. He looked me directly in the eyes, and in that moment, in the flickering light, I saw his eyes change color, from gray to black to that strange silver, and he told me, in a voice that sounded both young and ancient, that he wasn't entirely human anymore, that he hadn't been for a very long time. I should have run, should have screamed, called for help, locked myself in my apartment and never opened the door again. But instead, I asked him why he'd never come inside. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He blinked, and his eyes returned to their normal gray, and something like pain crossed his face. He told me it was complicated, that there were rules he had to follow, restrictions that came with what he was. He said that a vampire, he actually used that word, vampire, like it was the most normal thing in the world, couldn't enter someone's home without being invited. Not just verbally invited, but truly welcomed, with intent and understanding. He explained that all those times I'd asked him in casually, automatically, it hadn't been a real invitation. I hadn't known what I was inviting. I hadn't understood what it meant. And if he'd entered under false pretenses, if he'd crossed that threshold while I was ignorant of what he truly was, it would have bound us together in ways that couldn't be undone. He would have had access to me, my home, my life, my blood, in ways that no one should have access to another person. He told me he'd been fighting his nature since the night we met, that everything about me called to him, my scent, my warmth, the sound of my pulse, and that it took every ounce of his self-control not to lose himself in it. He said he'd stayed away during the day not because he'd burst into flames or turned to dust, but because sunlight made him vulnerable, weak, easier to lose control. He admitted that he'd been watching me even before we officially met, that he'd noticed me weeks before the blackout, and that he'd used that night as an excuse to finally speak to me. He confessed that he'd been trying to figure out how to tell me the truth, or if he should just disappear and let me move on with my life, but he couldn't do it, couldn't walk away. He said he'd tried, multiple times, but every time he made it as far as the next neighborhood before the pull to come back became unbearable. When he finished, the hallway was completely silent. Even the flickering light had steadied, as if the building itself was waiting to see what I would do. I asked him if he'd hurt anyone, if he'd killed people. He didn't answer right away. When he did, his voice was hollow, weighted with the kind of guilt that never fully fades. He told me he had, a long time ago, when he was young and didn't know how to control the hunger. But he'd learned, over the centuries, to survive without taking lives. It wasn't easy, and there were moments when the temptation was almost overwhelming, but he developed ways to manage it. He said he fed from blood banks, from volunteers who knew what he was and chose to help, from sources that didn't require him to be a monster. I asked him why he was telling me all of this. Why now, after months of hiding it? He looked at me with such raw vulnerability that my chest ached, and he told me that he was falling in love with me, that he'd probably been falling in love with me since the first night, and that living this lie, pretending to be human, pretending that we could have a normal relationship, was destroying him. He said he needed me to know the truth so I could make a real choice, stay or leave, let him in or lock him out. But either way, it had to be my decision, made with full knowledge of what he was and what it would mean. I sat there, processing his words, trying to reconcile the man I'd grown to care about with this impossible revelation. Everything in me said it was insane, that vampires were fiction, that this was some elaborate delusion or cruel joke. But I'd seen his eyes change, felt his cold skin, noticed all the little inconsistencies that I'd been explaining away for months. And deeper than that, somewhere in a place beyond logic, I knew he was telling the truth. I asked him to prove it, not because I didn't believe him, but because I needed something concrete, something undeniable. He nodded slowly, understanding what I was asking, and held up his hand. With his other hand, he drew one fingernail across his palm, cutting deep enough that I should have seen blood immediately. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the wound sealed itself, the skin knitting together so fast it looked like time-lapse footage. Within seconds, there was no trace of the cut except a thin white line that faded even as I watched. I felt dizzy. The hallway tilted, and I had to press my hands against the floor to keep from swaying. He asked if I was okay, if I needed him to leave, his voice full of concern that felt genuine despite the monstrous thing he'd just revealed himself to be. I told him I needed time to think, that this was too much to process in one conversation. He accepted that without argument, stood up, and told me he'd respect whatever decision I made. He said that if I wanted him to leave the building, to disappear from my life completely, he would. But if I wanted him to stay, if I wanted to see where this could go, knowing what he was, he would do everything in his power to make sure I was safe, protected, cherished. Then he walked away, and I sat alone in that hallway for another hour, trying to make sense of a world that had just been turned upside down. The days that followed were surreal. I moved through my routine mechanically, working, eating, sleeping, but my mind was elsewhere. I researched vampire lore online, trying to separate fact from fiction, knowing that most of it was probably wrong but desperate for any framework to understand what was happening. I thought about calling someone, telling a friend or family member, but what would I even say? That my boyfriend was a vampire. They'd think I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had, but the more I thought about it, the more things made sense. Not in a comforting way, but in the way a puzzle comes together even when you don't like the picture it forms. His ability to always know when I needed him. His uncanny knack for showing up at the right moments. Maybe it wasn't luck. Maybe he could sense me somehow, track my emotions or my heartbeat, the way time seemed to bend around him, how hours would pass like minutes when we were together. Maybe that was just the effect he had on me, or maybe it was something more. Something about the way he existed outside the normal flow of time, and Mrs. Castellano's warning, she'd seen him decades ago, looking exactly the same, because he was the same, unchanging, eternal. Part of me wanted to run, to pack my bags, break my lease, move to another city, and try to forget this had ever happened. But another part, a part I was almost ashamed to acknowledge, was drawn to him even more now. There was something darkly romantic about it all. The idea of being loved by someone who'd seen centuries, who chose me out of all the people he could have pursued. The fantasy of being special enough to capture the attention of someone so fundamentally other. I knew that was dangerous thinking. I knew it was the same instinct that made people stay in relationships that hurt them, that made them believe they could fix someone or that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. But it was also true that in all the time I'd known him, Dante had never hurt me, never pressured me, never made me feel unsafe, even when I hadn't known what he was. If anything, he'd been almost too careful, too concerned with my well-being and consent. A week after our conversation in the hallway, I made my decision. I texted him and asked if he could come to my apartment, not to the hallway, but to actually come inside. I told him I needed to see him, that we needed to talk face to face. He responded immediately, asking if I was sure, reminding me what it meant to truly invite him in, that once I did, he'd be able to enter freely from that point forward, that I'd be giving him access not just to my home, but to my life in a way I couldn't take back. I wrote back that yes, I understood, and yes, I was sure. 20 minutes later, he was standing outside my door. I opened it fully this time. No chain lock, no barriers between us. He stood on the threshold, waiting, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes betraying his anxiety. I looked at him, really looked at him, taking in every detail. The way his chest didn't rise and fall with breath, the absolute stillness of his body, no fidgeting or unconscious movements, the predatory grace that I'd mistaken for confidence. And I told him, slowly and clearly, that he was welcome in my home, that I invited him inside, knowing exactly what he was and what it meant. For a moment, nothing happened. We stood there, separated by an invisible line that had kept us apart for months. Then he stepped forward, crossing the threshold, and the air between us seemed to thicken, to hum with energy. He took another step, and another, until he was fully inside my apartment, the door closing behind him with a soft click. The look on his face was one of relief and wonder and something close to fear. He told me that in all his centuries of existence, he'd never felt anything like what he felt for me. That letting someone know the truth about him, letting someone choose him anyway, it was both the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing he'd experienced. I stepped closer to him, close enough that I could feel the cold radiating off his skin, and asked him if he was going to kiss me now. He smiled, a real smile, not the careful one he usually wore, and told me that he'd been wanting to since the night we met. When his lips met mine, they were cold, but not unpleasantly so. It was like being kissed by winter itself, sharp and clear and strangely intoxicating. He was gentle at first, almost hesitant, as if he was afraid I might shatter. But when I pressed closer, when I wrapped my arms around him and pulled him deeper into the kiss, something in him seemed to break free. His hands tangled in my hair, his body pressed against mine, and for the first time, I felt the full weight of his desire, no longer held back by walls and rules and the fear of revealing himself. When we finally broke apart, both of us breathing hard. Well, me breathing hard, him just caught up in the moment. He rested his forehead against mine and whispered that he'd never wanted anything as much as he wanted me, and that terrified him. I asked him why, and he told me that want, for someone like him, was dangerous, that it could turn into obsession, into possession, into something that destroyed rather than nurtured. He said he'd have to be careful, that we'd have to establish boundaries and rules, because without them, he could easily lose himself in the consuming need to keep me close, to protect me, to make sure nothing ever took me away from him. His honesty should have scared me, should have sent me running, but instead, it made me feel safe, because he was aware of the danger, aware of his own capacity for darkness, and was actively fighting against it. We spent that night talking. He told me stories about his past, about the life he'd lived before he was turned, about the centuries that followed. He'd been born in Italy in the late 1700s, turned in his mid-20s by a vampire who'd seen potential in him. He described those early years as a nightmare, learning to control the hunger, coming to terms with what he'd become, watching everyone he'd known grow old and die while he remained frozen. He'd moved around constantly, never staying in one place long enough for people to notice he didn't age. He'd lived through wars, revolutions, technological transformations that would have seemed like magic to his younger self. He'd loved before, a few times over the centuries, but never like this. Never with someone who knew what he was and chose him anyway. I asked him about the practical aspects, how he survived, what he needed, what the risks were. He was honest about all of it. He fed every few weeks, small amounts from multiple sources to avoid hurting anyone. Sunlight made him weak but wouldn't kill him. That was Hollywood fiction. Steaks, garlic, crosses, all myths. The only real way to kill him was catastrophic damage to the heart or brain, or complete destruction by fire. He could eat food if he wanted to, but it gave him no sustenance and usually made him ill after. He could be around people during the day, but he was slower, less sharp, more vulnerable to injury. And yes, he could turn others, but it was a horrible process, physically and emotionally agonizing, and the chances of the person surviving the transition were slim. Most people died before the transformation completed. Those who survived were often driven mad by the initial hunger and the weight of what they'd become. He made me promise that I'd never ask him to turn me, that if I ever felt that urge, I'd talk to him first and let him explain, in detail, why it was a terrible idea. I agreed, even though part of me was already wondering what it would be like to live outside of time, to exist in that liminal space between human and monster. The weeks that followed were the happiest of my life. Dante and I fell into a routine that felt surprisingly normal despite the supernatural circumstances. He'd come over after sunset, and we'd cook dinner together. Or rather, I'd cook while he kept me company, telling stories or asking about my day. We'd watch movies, read books out loud to each other, make love with a passion that felt both ancient and brand new. He never fed from me. I offered, multiple times, but he always refused. He told me that drinking from someone you loved was intimate in ways I couldn't imagine, that it created a bond that could become addictive for both parties. He said he didn't want to risk tainting what we had with the primal hunger that came with feeding. I tried to respect his decision, but I'd be lying if I said I wasn't curious. There was something darkly appealing about the idea of sustaining him, of being the source of his survival in such a literal way. But I understood his caution. Everything about our relationship required careful balance. My humanity against his inhumanity, my mortality against his immortality, my need for normalcy against the reality that nothing about us was normal. People at the building started to notice the change in me. I was happier, more confident, less isolated. Some neighbors smiled and made comments about how good it was to see me doing well. Others, like Mrs. Castellano, watched with expressions that bordered on concern. I ran into her in the lobby one morning, and she pulled me aside, asking if I was all right, if I knew what I was doing. She told me that she understood the appeal of someone like Dante, mysterious, charming, different from everyone else. But she reminded me that some differences couldn't be overcome, that some relationships were doomed from the start because the fundamental nature of the people involved was too incompatible. I thanked her for her concern but told her I knew what I was doing, that I was making my choices with open eyes. She shook her head sadly and told me that people in love never think they're making mistakes until it's too late to undo them. Her words haunted me more than I wanted to admit, because as happy as I was, there was a shadow hanging over everything. The knowledge that Dante would watch me age while he stayed the same, that I'd grow old, get sick, die, while he continued on, unchanged and unchanging, that our time together, no matter how perfect, was limited by my mortality. I tried not to think about it, tried to live in the present, to enjoy what we had without worrying about the inevitable end. But late at night, when Dante was beside me, I'd watch him and wonder what it would be like to exist as he did, to have centuries stretching ahead instead of decades, to love someone and know that even death couldn't separate you. And then, about 4 months into our relationship, things started to change. It began small. Objects in my apartment would be in different places than I remembered leaving them. My laptop, which I always closed and set on my desk, would be open with tabs I didn't remember searching. My journals, which I'd been keeping since the night Dante revealed himself, would have pages that seemed to have been read, the spine creased in places where it shouldn't have been. At first, I told myself I was just being forgetful, that I was moving things and not remembering, that my memory was playing tricks on me. But then I came home one evening to find my entire bookshelf reorganized. Not randomly, it was actually better organized than before, alphabetized by author and sorted by genre. But I hadn't done it, and Dante had been with me all day. When I asked him about it later that night, he looked genuinely confused. He told me he hadn't been in my apartment during the day, that he'd been at his place working. He'd started taking on some freelance consulting jobs to keep himself occupied during the daylight hours. I believed him, but that meant someone else had been in my home. The feeling of being watched intensified, not just in my apartment, but everywhere. Walking to the store, I'd feel eyes on me. Sitting in a cafe, I'd catch shadows moving in my peripheral vision that disappeared when I turned to look. At night, I'd hear sounds, footsteps on the floor above me, scratching at the window, the soft whisper of movement in the walls. I told Dante about it, expecting him to reassure me, to tell me it was nothing. Instead, his expression went dark. He asked me to describe everything, the moved objects, the reorganized books, the sounds, the sensation of being watched. As I talked, I watched his jaw tighten, his hands curl into fists. When I finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. He wasn't the only vampire in the city. There was a whole community of them, spread throughout the urban landscape, each with their own territories and rules. When he'd moved into this building, he'd notified them as a courtesy, established that this area was under his protection. But apparently, not everyone respected those boundaries. He said there were some of his kind who viewed humans as prey, nothing more. others who saw relationships like ours as dangerous, as breaking unspoken rules about separation between species, and still others who might see me as an opportunity, a way to hurt Dante, to challenge his claim on this territory, or simply to amuse themselves by tormenting someone under another vampire's protection. He told me he'd increased his patrols of the building at night, that he'd been checking on me even when I thought I was alone, but during the day, when he was weaker, he couldn't be there to watch over me. The realization that I was being hunted, because that's what it was, I understood now. A predator circling its prey, made everything tilt. The world I'd been adjusting to, the careful balance Dante and I had built, suddenly felt fragile. He held me while I processed this, his cold arms wrapped around me, and promised that he wouldn't let anyone hurt me, that he'd die before he allowed another vampire to touch me. The intensity of his vow should have been comforting. Instead, it made me acutely aware of how dangerous my life had become. Over the next few weeks, the incidents escalated. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to find my window open, even though I'd locked it. I'd discover handprints on the glass, smaller than Dante's, more delicate. Once, I came home to find a dead bird on my doorstep, arranged carefully with its wings spread, almost like an offering or a threat. Dante was there every night now, sleeping, or rather resting, since he didn't truly sleep, beside me. During the day, he'd installed additional locks on my doors and windows, given me a phone with his number on speed dial, made me promise to call him immediately if anything seemed off. He'd also started teaching me things. How to recognize the presence of a vampire, the subtle drop in temperature, the way the air felt heavier, the instinctive fear that crept up your spine. How to protect myself, not effectively, he admitted, because a human against a vampire was always outmatched, but enough to buy time for help to arrive. He gave me a necklace, a silver chain with a small pendant that looked like an abstract design but was actually a symbol of his protection. He told me that as long as I wore it, other vampires would know I was claimed, that touching me meant declaring war on him. I asked if it would really stop them, and he was honest. Some would respect the symbol, others would see it as a challenge, and a few wouldn't care either way. Not exactly reassuring. The breaking point came on a Friday night in late March. Dante had gone out to meet with some of the local vampire community. Apparently, there were periodic gatherings where they discussed territory disputes, shared information, and maintained the fragile peace that kept their existence secret. He'd been reluctant to leave me, but I'd insisted. I couldn't live my life in constant fear, couldn't have him hovering over me every second. Besides, I was in my apartment, doors locked, windows secured, wearing the protection necklace. What could happen? I was working on a design project, headphones on, completely absorbed in my work, when I felt it. That sudden drop in temperature, the pressure in the air, the primal fear that made every hair on my body stand up. I yanked off my headphones and spun around. There was someone in my apartment, not Dante. I knew instantly it wasn't him. This presence felt different, sharper, more malicious, like broken glass wrapped in silk. A woman stepped out of the shadows near my hallway. She was beautiful in the same unsettling way Dante was, with pale skin and dark hair and eyes that were too bright, too focused. She was dressed elegantly, like she'd just come from an expensive dinner party, and she moved with the kind of grace that made my own movements feel clumsy and crude. She told me, in a voice like honey laced with poison, that I'd been causing quite a stir in their community, that Dante's obsession with a human was seen as a weakness by some, an insult by others, and a fascinating experiment by her. I asked who she was, trying to keep my voice steady even though I was terrified. She introduced herself as Seraphine and told me she was what they called an elder, a vampire old enough to remember the original bloodlines, powerful enough that even other vampires feared her. She said she'd been curious about me since Dante had first notified the community of my existence. She wanted to see what made me special enough to capture the attention of someone as careful and controlled as Dante. I told her to leave, that I was under Dante's protection, that he'd be back soon. She laughed, and the sound was like wind chimes made of bones. She told me that Dante's protection meant nothing if she chose to ignore it, that I was only alive because she found the situation entertaining, not because some relatively young vampire had claimed me. Then she did something that made my heart stop. She crossed the room in a blur of movement, too fast for my eyes to follow, and she was suddenly in front of me, her face inches from mine. Her hand came up, fingers cold as ice, and she touched my cheek almost tenderly. She told me she could smell Dante on me, that the bond between us was strong but ultimately fragile. She said she could kill me right now, drain me dry, and leave my body for him to find. Or she could turn me herself, make me one of them, tie me to her instead of to him. But where would be the fun in that? She wanted to see how this played out, wanted to watch Dante struggle with the impossible balance between keeping me safe and maintaining his own nature. She said she'd been alive for over 1,000 years, and the one thing that never got old was watching people, humans and vampires alike, destroy themselves through love. Then she leaned in close, her lips nearly brushing my ear, and whispered that I should enjoy my time with Dante while it lasted, because one way or another, our story would end in tragedy. Either I'd grow old and die, leaving him alone for another century until the pain faded, or I'd beg him to turn me, and I'd discover that immortality wasn't the gift it seemed. Or, and this option seemed to delight her most, another vampire would eventually get to me, and Dante would have to live with the knowledge that he couldn't protect me. She pulled back, smiled at me with teeth that were just slightly too sharp, and then she was gone. Not walking out, just gone, as if she'd never been there at all. I stood there, shaking, tears streaming down my face, until Dante burst through the door 15 minutes later. He took one look at me and knew immediately what had happened. He could smell her, he told me later, could sense the lingering trace of her power in my apartment. He held me while I sobbed, whispering apologies, promising it wouldn't happen again, saying he should have been there. But underneath his words, I could hear the helplessness, the understanding that he couldn't always protect me, that there were forces in his world more powerful than him, and that my association with him had painted a target on my back. That night changed everything. The relationship that had felt like a dark fairy tale suddenly felt like a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. Every shadow could hide a vampire. Every stranger could be a threat. The apartment that had been my safe haven now felt like a cage. Dante suggested I move in with him, that his apartment had protections mine didn't, wards and symbols that would keep most vampires out. But I refused. Moving in with him felt like admitting defeat, like letting fear control my life entirely. Instead, I decided I needed answers. Real answers about what I'd gotten myself into, about the world Dante lived in, about whether there was actually any future for us or if we were just delaying the inevitable. So I asked him to introduce me to his world, not as someone he was protecting, but as someone who wanted to understand. I told him I needed to meet others like him, to see how they lived, to know what I was really choosing if I stayed with him. He was reluctant at first. He told me that most vampires weren't like him, that they wouldn't treat me with respect or kindness, that exposing me to that world was dangerous. But I insisted. I reminded him that ignorance hadn't kept me safe. Seraphine had found me anyway. At least if I understood the rules, understood the players, I might be able to navigate this world with something other than blind faith. Finally, reluctantly, he agreed. The following Saturday, he took me to what he called a neutral ground, an old church that had been abandoned for decades and repurposed by the vampire community as a meeting place. The irony of vampires gathering in a church wasn't lost on me, but Dante explained that most of the religious symbols and rules around vampires were fiction. Crosses didn't hurt them. Holy water was just water. Churches were only significant because they were old, private, and central locations. Walking into that church was one of the most terrifying experiences of my life. There were perhaps 20 vampires there, all of them turning to stare at me as I entered with Dante's hand protectively on my lower back. Their eyes, God, their eyes, all had that same predatory intensity, that same inhuman focus. Dante introduced me to a few of them. There was Marcus, no relation to my ex, thankfully, who'd been turned during the Civil War and still spoke with a slight Southern accent. Elena, who'd been a silent film star before her turning and still carried herself with that old Hollywood glamour. Chen, who was apparently over 500 years old and one of the most respected members of the community. They were all cordial, but there was an underlying tension. Questions about why Dante had brought a human here. Observations about how fragile I looked, how easy it would be to break me. Comments about my scent, my heartbeat, the warmth of my blood. All said casually, but with an edge that made me want to run. Seraphine was there too, watching from the shadows with an amused smile, clearly enjoying my discomfort. At one point, Elena pulled me aside while Dante was talking with Chen. She told me, in a voice that was trying to be kind but came across as pitying, that she understood the appeal of what I had with Dante. She'd had a human lover once, decades ago. She said it was beautiful while it lasted, but ultimately unsustainable. The human had aged while she stayed young, and eventually, the gap between them became too wide to bridge. He'd begged her to turn him, and when she refused, he'd grown bitter, resentful. They'd ended on bad terms, and he'd died a few years later, still angry at her for denying him immortality. She told me she wasn't trying to scare me, just prepare me. That loving a vampire meant accepting that you'd always be the one with the expiration date, always be the one who had to let go. I asked her if she regretted it, loving him. She smiled sadly and told me that regret was a luxury vampires couldn't afford. If they regretted every loss, every person they'd loved who died, they'd be paralyzed by grief. So they learned to compartmentalize, to cherish the memories, but not let them destroy them. Her words stayed with me long after we left the church. On the drive home, Dante was quiet. Finally, I asked him what he was thinking. He told me he was thinking about how wrong it was to bring me into his world, how selfish he'd been to pursue me when he knew how it would end. He said he'd been alive for over 200 years, and in all that time, he'd never felt as vulnerable as he did now, because I was his weakness, his one point of failure, the place where someone could hurt him more deeply than any physical wound. I told him he was also my weakness, that vulnerability was part of love, that maybe it was worth the risk. He pulled over to the side of the road, turned to face me, and asked me seriously if I understood what I was signing up for. Not just the danger from other vampires, but the inevitable ending. The fact that in 60 years, if I was lucky, I'd be gone and he'd still be here, moving on to the next century while I was nothing but a memory. I told him I understood, but that I'd rather have 50 years with him than a lifetime without him. He kissed me then, desperately, like he was trying to convince himself that this could work, that love was enough. But I could taste the doubt on his lips. The months that followed were a strange mixture of happiness and dread. We fell deeper in love, building a life together that looked almost normal from the outside. But underneath, there was always the awareness of time slipping away, of the impossibility of our situation. I started noticing myself aging in ways I never had before. A new wrinkle here, a gray hair there. Things that I'd normally ignore suddenly felt significant, like evidence of the growing gap between us. Dante, meanwhile, remained unchanged, frozen, perfect. And I'd be lying if I said I wasn't tempted. The idea of turning, of becoming what he was, started to feel less like a horror and more like a solution. We could have forever together. I'd never have to watch him grieve me. We'd never have to say goodbye. I brought it up one night, carefully, trying to make it sound like a hypothetical conversation rather than a request. He shut it down immediately, told me that he'd made me promise not to ask, that the answer was no, that he wouldn't damn me to his existence no matter how much I thought I wanted it. I asked him why it was his choice, why he got to decide what I did with my life. He told me that because he loved me, because he knew the reality of what being a vampire meant. He couldn't stand by and watch me destroy my humanity. He said that the transition was agonizing, that most people didn't survive it, and that those who did often spent the first decades consumed by bloodlust and regret. I argued that I was strong enough, that with him to guide me, I could handle it. He looked at me with such sadness and told me that everyone thought they were strong enough, that everyone believed their love would be enough to make immortality bearable. But he'd seen it happen dozens of times over the centuries, humans begging to be turned, convinced it was the answer, only to discover that eternity was a prison they couldn't escape. He said that if he truly loved me, he had to protect me from that fate, even if it meant losing me to time instead. We didn't speak for 3 days after that fight, the longest we'd gone without talking since we'd gotten together. When we finally reconciled, there was a new understanding between us. This was the path we were on, and neither of us could change it. We could either accept the terms, finite time together, mortality separating us eventually, or we could walk away now before the inevitable end hurt even more. We chose to stay, to make the most of the time we had, but something had shifted. The relationship that had felt like an adventure now felt like a countdown. And then, last week, something happened that changed everything. I was walking home from the grocery store, arms full of bags, when I was attacked, not by a vampire, by a regular human, a man trying to rob me. He grabbed me from behind, demanded my purse, and when I didn't move fast enough, he pulled a knife. I don't remember much after that. There was a struggle, the blade cutting across my arm, me screaming, and then suddenly Dante was there. I don't know how he knew, how he found me, but he appeared out of nowhere and pulled the man off me with a force that sent him flying into a brick wall. The would-be robber ran off, and Dante turned to me, his eyes wide with panic. He grabbed my arm, examining the wound, and I watched his entire body go rigid. His eyes, they changed. From gray to black, the pupils dilating until there was almost no color left. His lips pulled back slightly, and I saw his teeth, saw the fangs that he usually kept hidden, extending and sharpening. He was staring at my blood, at the wound on my arm, and I could see him fighting himself. Every muscle in his body was tense, his hands shaking as they held my arm, his breathing, which he didn't technically need to do, coming in rapid, shallow gasps. I realized in that moment what was happening. He was losing control. The scent of my blood, fresh and warm, was overwhelming his carefully maintained restraint. I called his name, trying to pull him back, but he didn't seem to hear me. His eyes were fixed on the blood running down my arm, and he leaned closer, his nose almost touching my skin. I should have been terrified, should have pulled away, run, called for help. But instead, I made a decision that I still can't fully explain. I told him it was okay, that if he needed to feed, if this was what would keep him from losing himself completely, then he could take from me, that I trusted him. My words seemed to snap him out of it, at least partially. He looked up at me, his eyes still mostly black but with a flicker of recognition, and shook his head violently. He told me no, that he couldn't, that once he started he might not be able to stop, but I could see the war raging in him, the human part, or whatever remained of his humanity, fighting against the predator. And I knew that if he didn't feed, if he tried to suppress the hunger after being this close to losing control, it would be worse next time. So I told him again that it was okay, that I was choosing this, that I wanted to help him. Finally, reluctantly, with tears that looked like blood gathering in the corners of his eyes, he lowered his head to my arm. The first touch of his lips against my skin made me gasp, not from pain. He'd been so careful to avoid the wound itself, but from the strange intimacy of it. Then I felt his teeth break the skin, a sharp sting that quickly faded into something else entirely. Warmth spread from the point where he was feeding, radiating through my body like liquid sunlight. It wasn't painful. If anything, it was pleasurable in a way I hadn't expected, euphoric and dreamlike. I could feel our connection deepening, could sense his emotions bleeding into mine. The guilt, the hunger, the love, the desperation. Time seemed to stop, or maybe it sped up. I couldn't tell. All I knew was that I was standing in an alley, bleeding into the mouth of a vampire who loved me, and instead of being afraid, I felt more connected to him than I ever had before. When he finally pulled away, his eyes had returned to their normal gray, and he looked horrified. He immediately started tending to my wound, wrapping it with cloth torn from his own shirt, apologizing over and over. But I stopped him, took his face in my hands and told him that I didn't regret it, that I'd do it again if he needed me to. He told me that was exactly what he'd been afraid of, that now that we'd crossed that line, it would be harder to resist next time, that the bond between us had deepened in ways that couldn't be undone. He was right. Ever since that night, I've felt different, more aware of him, even when he's not nearby. I can sense his moods, sometimes know what he's thinking before he says it, and the desire to let him feed from me again. It's constant, almost addictive. He's been avoiding me since then. Not completely. He still checks on me every night, still makes sure I'm safe, but he won't come inside my apartment, won't let himself get too close. He's terrified of what might happen if he loses control again, and I understand his fear. I do. But part of me is angry too. Angry that he gets to make all the decisions about our relationship, about what's safe and what's too dangerous. Angry that he's pulling away right when I feel closest to him. That's where I am now, sitting in my apartment, trying to make sense of everything that's happened, trying to figure out if love is supposed to feel like this, like you're standing on the edge of a cliff, exhilarated and terrified in equal measure, not sure if you're about to fly or fall. Seraphine's words keep echoing in my head, that our story would end in tragedy, one way or another. Maybe she's right. Maybe there's no happy ending for a human and a vampire. Maybe we're just postponing the inevitable heartbreak. But when I close my eyes, I can still feel Dante's lips on my skin, can still sense the echo of our connection. And I know despite everything, despite the danger, despite the impossibility, despite the countdown clock hanging over us, that I don't want to give this up. Not yet. Maybe not ever. So I'm making a choice. I'm going to go to his apartment right now, and I'm going to tell him that I'm done with halfway. That if we're going to do this, if we're going to love each other despite all the reasons we shouldn't, then we need to do it fully. No more pulling away. No more trying to protect me from the reality of what he is. I don't know what he'll say. Don't know if he'll let me in, literally and figuratively. Don't know if this is bravery or stupidity. But I'm about to find out. Because here's what I've learned over these past months. Fear might be my brain's way of protecting me. But sometimes the things worth having are on the other side of fear. Sometimes you have to step into the darkness to find the light. And Dante Ashmore, vampire, monster, the love of my life, he's my darkness and my light all at once. So if you're listening to this, if you've followed my story this far, I want you to ask yourself, What would you do if you found love in the most impossible place, with the most impossible person? Would you walk away because it was the safe choice? Or would you step forward, knowing that it might destroy you? Because the alternative, never knowing what could have been, would destroy you just as surely. I'm choosing to step forward. I'm choosing him. I'm choosing us. Whatever that means, whatever it costs, however it ends. And if that makes me foolish, if that makes me reckless, if that makes me someone who ignored all the warnings and dove in anyway, then so be it. Because I've spent my whole life playing it safe, building walls, protecting myself from getting hurt. And where did it get me? Alone, isolated, half alive, at least now, loving someone who isn't even technically alive. I finally feel like I'm living. I'm standing at his door now. My hand is raised to knock. My heart is pounding so hard I can hear it in my ears. And I know he can hear it too. Wherever he is on the other side of this door, this is it. The moment where everything changes or everything ends. I'm knocking now. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. The same way he knocked on my door all those months ago, during the blackout that brought us together. I hear movement inside, footsteps approaching, the lock turning, the doors opening. He's standing there, looking at me with those storm cloud eyes, and I can see everything in them, love and fear and hunger and restraint, all warring for dominance. I'm telling him that I'm done being afraid, that I want all of it, the danger, the darkness, the impossible love, that I'm choosing him, fully and completely, with eyes wide open. He's pulling me inside. The door is closing behind us. His arms are around me, and he's whispering my name like a prayer and a curse at the same time. And whatever happens next, whatever our ending turns out to be, at least I'll know I chose it. At least I'll know I loved fiercely and completely, even if it was foolish. At least I'll know I was brave enough to step into the darkness and find out what was waiting there. Even if that darkness has fangs,